Scandalous Sisterhood of Prickwillow Place. And this is another historical fiction mystery. And what I would say about this book is in the past, specifically in the 19th century when this book takes place, if you wanted to have a school, all you needed was a house and a sign in front of your house that said this is a school. You didn't really need any sort of training or credentials, you could just do it. And so in this book, what has happened is this older woman, her name is Mrs. Plackett, after her husband died, well, the good news is he had money, but the bad news is he hid his money because he didn't trust banks, and before he died, he didn't tell his wife where he hid his money. So for her, she needed a way to make some money to be able to afford food to eat and just to have her basic needs met, and so she decided to open a school. But this woman, Mrs. Plackett, doesn't like kids. She doesn't want to teach or anything. She just wants money. And so she has at her school 7 girls. You can see them on the cover here. And what she's done is basically people have sent their daughters to this school with the idea that they're going to be raised until adulthood. You know, they will stay at the school and they will learn good etiquette and basically not much that is very educational, but perhaps it will help them to be good wives in the future. So Mrs. Plackett basically has these girls who are kind of live-in housekeepers and maids. You know, they can kind of keep the house and they are the people responsible for cooking food. And they play music, they read books, but as a school experience, all of these girls understand that, okay, you know, the person running our school does not care. And every Sunday, what happens is Mrs. Plackett invites her brother over for Sunday dinner after church. And on the Sunday this book begins, in fact, on the very second page, what happens is the girls have made some veal for dinner. And the thing about Mrs. Plackett is, okay, she's very conscious of money. She kind of has to be, but she has enough money. She could afford to feed the kids better, but she doesn't. In fact, whenever they buy meat, okay, there's only enough meat for Sunday dinner for Mrs. Plackett and her brother, Mr. Godding. And so at dinner, these two are, you know, everybody's enjoying their food, they're eating, and what happens, very suddenly, Mrs. Plackett starts choking. And her brother says, oh, you know, what's up? You need a glass of water? What's going on? Well, she falls over onto the floor, and almost immediately Mr. Godding also starts apparently to choke. But then he falls over too, and the girls are surprised because these two are both dead. I mean, they check, and it's like, oh, they're not breathing. So, all right, what do we do now? And the first conversation they have is, what killed them? How are they just suddenly dead? And one of the girls, I believe Louise, points out, okay, well, they must have been poisoned. And everybody else is like, what do you mean? We were all eating dinner. We're not dropping dead. And Louise says, yeah, but think about it. They're the only two who ate the meat. There must have been something in the meat, and that's what killed them. So almost immediately, the question becomes, what do we do? Normally in this situation, obviously, you would go and send for somebody, let people know that this terrible thing has happened. But this school, Mrs. Plackett's house, it's a couple miles outside of town, and they don't really have many close neighbors. And what this means is Kitty, who is the oldest girl, she says, hey, you know, I've really enjoyed living here. Obviously, Mrs. Plackett wasn't great, but, you know, you guys are my friends, and I've really enjoyed being here. My concern now is if we tell people what has happened, our parents are going to send us to different schools, and they might be even worse than this one. So, what if we just didn't tell anybody? What if we just run the school ourselves? And at first everybody's like, what do you... No, there's no way that could work. But Kitty says, hey, think about it. We know that Mrs. Plackett and Mr. Godding, they have family in India. What if we make up a story about them leaving suddenly because, oh, you know, our nephew who lives in India got sick and we're going to go be with our family. I mean, they could be away for a while. And, I mean, as those of us who are the oldest get older, I mean, once we're adults, we could start running the school. Nobody's going to check that closely. I mean, nobody's been keeping tabs on us so far. I don't think anybody is going to investigate this too closely. Well, this is a fine idea, except all of a sudden there is a knock on the door. So everybody kind of panics, but Kitty at this point is like taking charge. So it's like, okay, Mrs. Plackett, just put her in her bedroom. Mr. Godding, I don't know, just shove him in a closet or something. And Katie goes to the door. She answers it like, okay, I'm gonna pretend everything's fine. And at the door, there is a local man who's come, and he says, "Hey, I'm here for the party." And Kitty says, "Oh, great." And what she finds out from this visitor is it was Mr. Godding's birthday. And Mrs. Plackett wanted to surprise her brother. Isn't that nice? Well, surprised, they're both dead. So Kitty has this man go into the living room, and she goes back to the other girls and says, "Okay, I think we're about to get caught. Like, we can't go through with this. There's no way we can get rid of these people. They're wondering where the birthday boy is and where Mrs. Plackett is." But then one of the other girls, Alice, says, "Wait a minute. What if I go upstairs and I put on some of Mrs. Plackett's clothing? You know, she's a widow. Sometimes she wears a veil. I can make myself up to look like her and then pretend to be Mrs. Plackett. I think I can fool these people." And sure enough, I mean, more people arrive for the party, and everybody's getting more and more nervous. But finally, Alice comes back downstairs. And sure enough, she is wearing Mrs. Plackett's veil and her clothes, and she's kind of like powdered her hair so it's like the right color, but it's like hidden enough that, okay, she looks like a silver-haired old lady. And with the veil, this is a face covering. Can't see her face. This is a thing sometimes. If you're a widow, if you're in mourning, you might wear this. And Alice is able to do a good enough impression of Mrs. Plackett's voice. She says, "Oh, thank you so much, everybody, for coming. Unfortunately, my brother had to rush off to the train station. We've just had a letter that our nephew in India is very ill, and so he's going to go and arrange for travel. We're going to try and get there and see him." And this fools the people. Everybody leaves. So what the girls do next, I mean, it's nighttime. They start digging a hole in the garden, and they bury the bodies. And the rest of the book is these 7 people trying to figure out what really happened, because none of them murdered Mrs. Plackett and her brother, so they're wondering who did. And all they can think is, well, wait a minute. Mr. Plackett, the guy who died, the reason Mrs. Plackett opened the school in the first place, he had all this money, and he hid it. Maybe somebody's trying to get their hands on the money. And we need to find it first because, again, this person has committed murder. We don't know who they are, and we need to be cautious of this. But at the same time, they're trying to cover up the fact that they have hidden 2 bodies. So it's a very entertaining book, and if you like murder mysteries, check it out.